This episode of the Treasures from Above podcast is being recorded on Good Friday 2025. And I'm taking the message from Sunday, the 16th of June 2013. And I think it's fitting for what it is that Good Friday stands to remind us of, which is the sacrifice of Christ. And the message for today is free from bondage. Now, the original scriptures that were taken from, or that were in this message, were Romans chapter 7 and chapter 8. But I'm not going to read those today just for the sake of time, and also because I want to point out a few things and something from another scripture that I'll read towards the end of this episode as well. But when we're talking about freedom, and particularly the freedom that Christ procured for us on the cross, which is what Good Friday is in remembrance of, there are two broad categories that we can put all freedoms into. You can have free from, freedom from, and then you can have free to, freedom to. Freedom from something and freedom to do something. And a lot of the time, people outside of Christianity, and sometimes inside Christianity as well, can only consider free to as freedoms. A lot of people only consider when they are free to do something that is a freedom. A lot of people don't really consider that freedom from something is also freedom, and a lot of the time far more weighty a freedom than freedom to do something. From the outside, freedom to do something can often look better. It can look a lot more inviting, and it can stand out a lot more to people as an actual freedom rather than being free from something. Take our liberty, our freedom to go outside. We are free to go outside. And if you're comparing yourself to somebody who is in a prison, that can, seem very clear. Like, we have this freedom to do something that those other people don't have. That can seem very clear. But there's a deception in that. I think there's a deception in that. And philosophers have thought about this quite a bit. And there's this idea in philosophy called psychological hedonism, or sometimes it's called motivational hedonism. What is hedonism? Hedonism comes from the Greek word meaning pleasure. And hedonism basically encompasses living for pleasure and the avoidance of displeasure. Motivational hedonism basically says that human beings are hardwired such that every single action they do is for pleasure, to seek out pleasure, and to avoid displeasure. And, there are a lot of issues with that way of thinking for philosophers, right? There are certain things like that. You might have heard somebody say something along the lines of, if somebody, or they might say something like, can someone ever do something truly selfless? Right, that's a question that people sometimes ask. And it's around this motivational hedonism, such that, like, even if somebody does something that seems very selfless on the outside, are they really doing it for selfish reasons? Right? If, say, a soldier jumps on a grenade to, save their comrades from being hurt from that grenade, from the outside that can look like an extremely selfless act. But a motivational hedonist would say, actually, that soldier was doing it for some sort of internalized pleasure that they would get from doing that act. Maybe that pleasure would be the thought of them dying a hero. Right, that would be something that a motivational hedonist would say that's the actual reason why they're doing it, not a real, truly selfless act. Now, there are a lot of issues with that way of thinking philosophically, but I don't necessarily want to talk about those today. What I really want to talk about is, if that is even true, Let's assume it's true. And let's assume that people follow that hedonistic lifestyle where everything they do, every motivation they have is for seeking out pleasure and for avoiding displeasure. In other words, free to. A motivational hedonistic lifestyle is a lifestyle that encompasses all of the free to drink, free to party, free to have sex as much as you want, free to, do whatever you like. Anything that brings you pleasure, and anything that has displeasure, you avoid it. Free to do whatever you want. A lot of people, when they're indulging in a hedonistic lifestyle outside of Christianity, they look at Christianity and they think, well, I'm not going to have the freedom to do these things that I can now do in this hedonistic lifestyle. Therefore, Christianity is bondage. Right? They look at the lifestyle that they're living. Christ himself spoke about this somewhat in John chapter 3 when he said that people who reject the light don't want to come into the light because their evil deeds will be exposed. And a lot of people, that's one of the main reasons why they don't want to come to Christ and why they reject Christianity. They see their lifestyle, their hedonistic lifestyle, where they can pursue any pleasure they want. They see all of these freedoms too as freedom, and they see Christianity as bondage because they won't have those freedoms. Freedom to do this, freedom to do that, freedom to do that. And there's so many problems with, one, that way of thinking, and two, that way of living. One of them that's been shown consistently in research and studies has been coined the hedonic treadmill. The hedonic treadmill. What does that mean? It means people and their perceived satisfaction of their life generally stays the same. There was this bit of research done in, I think it was 2011, where these group of researchers, they took people and they looked at people who had 3 major events happen in their life. One was a bereavement of a loved one. In this particular instance, it was the death of a husband. The second was divorce. The third was marriage. They looked at people who at some point in their life went through one of these 3 major life events. And they looked at these people and their perceived satisfaction of their life, both 3 years before the event, at the event, and 3 years after the event. And there were some differences in how the people, felt before and after, and there were some general things. But overall, people tended to stay the same. The perceived satisfaction of people 3 years before this major life event almost always was the same as their perceived satisfaction 3 years after the event. Think about what that means. If a woman loses her husband, if she felt very satisfied with her life 3 years before losing her husband, 3 years after, there is it was around a 90% chance, there's like a 90% chance that she'll feel just as satisfied 3 years after. And that's a major, major life event, losing a husband. Same thing for divorce, same thing for marriage. Of course, there were some differences in some people, but in general, most people, whatever their perceived satisfaction was before that major life event, it was the exact same after that major life event. There can be some changes during the event, but before and after, it was the same. And that says a lot about how pleasure and perceived satisfaction in humans actually is. You see, the hedonic treadmill is basically the paradox of pleasure seeking. It's that if you live a lifestyle where you are constantly seeking out pleasure, it doesn't actually result in pleasure. most people, like, you don't really change that much. Despite huge events that can happen, let alone small events, huge life events that happen don't really change people that much. Before and after, people tend to stay the same in their perceived life satisfaction. So if you're living a life where you're constantly seeking out pleasure, constantly seeking out, things that you believe you're free to do, you actually end up being bound to them. You actually end up in a type of bondage where you're constantly seeking out this pleasure and never really being fulfilled. Hence, that's why it's called the hedonic treadmill. It's like you're running, think about a treadmill. You're running, but you're not actually going anywhere. People who are on the hedonic treadmill, they are constantly seeking out pleasure, but never actually getting any closer to it. And you can see how people will think from the outset that they're free to do all of these things. They're free to seek out all of these pleasures. They're free to drink. They're free to smoke. They're free to have sex. They're free to do all of these pleasure-seeking things. But in actuality, they're in bondage to those things, because doing those things and constantly seeking out that pleasure doesn't actually result in pleasure. And this isn't just Christianity. This is actually, outside of Christianity, social studies and just, scientists have been studying this thing for decades now. And it's been shown very consistently that hedonic lifestyles do not lead to life satisfaction. Constant pleasure seeking doesn't lead to life satisfaction. It's actually been strongly related to increased levels of anxiety and depression. Strongly linked to. Also, things like addiction as well. If people are constantly seeking out the pleasure of, say, doing drugs, it is highly associated with increased rates of addiction as well, this hedonic lifestyle. So we can see again, people thinking that freedom to do drugs is freedom, but it actually results in bondage to drugs. Freedom to drink, people might see that as freedom, but it actually results in bondage to alcohol. And that's not what people would think from the outset. It looks glittering and shiny, freedom to do all of these things from the outset, but it's actually bondage. It's actually bondage. Pleasure seeking, constantly seeking out gratification and pleasure, living a life where all you want is pleasure, and everything that is displeasurable you try and minimize or get rid of, doesn't lead to actual fulfillment. This is one of the things that the gospel, and in particular Christ's work on the cross, frees us from. Remember, I said in the beginning that there's freedom to do things and there's also freedom from things. People on the outside of Christianity may think that they have genuine freedom because they're free to do all of these hedonistic things. However, it's been shown very consistently, and not just from Christians, people outside of Christianity in the sciences, been shown very consistently that the freedom to do all of these things actually results in bondage to these things. But the gospel and the work that Christ did for us is not just freedom to. We have a lot of freedoms too as well, but it's more so freedom from bondage, freedom from sin, freedom from addiction, freedom from lust, freedom from alcoholism, freedom from all of these things. And that is true freedom. That's true freedom. Freedom isn't the ability to go and seek every single pleasure under the sun. True freedom is being free from the bondage of all of those things. That's what Christ did for us. And I want to read one of my favorite passages in the Gospel of Matthew, which I think has all of this that I've said in a nutshell. Matthew chapter 11 from verse 28 says, "Come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Godspeed.